Warm hello to everybody out there on our blue planet. I wanted to kick this off, I think, with the most natural place to start thinking about having a Jedi Order as a religion. Uh, Namely, why to do it. What's the purpose? What's the point? What is it that I hope to accomplish by doing this? And maybe just talk a little bit openly about my thought process going into it, some of the philosophy that I think, and why Jedi in the first place. If we're going to talk about a religion, you can really set up anything. I mean, it just has to be a philosophy and follow the guidelines for a religious practice. But there's actually a very specific reason for all of this. So I want to get right into that. And then in future recordings like this, I want to try to do this once a week to get the conversation started, get the thought processes moving, and hopefully start involving people in this project. Ultimately, ultimately, what the goal is to have a fully, thoroughly established religion with core tenets, practices, a central location people can come to that also doubles as a civil service, so to speak. One of the reasons that I want to do this without getting too far ahead of myself, but I have seen the good of having a religious community. Just to give you a little bit about my personal experience with this, I lived through Hurricane Sandy in 2012. I was actually in a really bad place, hit really hard. And it took a little while before the Red Cross came in and took over and was supporting people with shelter and things like that. And that's a whole other story for a whole other time. But what had happened in the community that I was in is the only organizational center for taking care of people was the local church. So it can't be denied that there's a definite community value, a societal value to having those organizations. So that being said, why start a new religion? Why not find one that I can get along with and agree with? And there's a couple of reasons, and it also relates to why I think going with Jedi as the basis for the religion is a good idea. So first, in addition to having social benefits, I think that there is some very real evidence for the idea that religions were created by human beings as a way to make some sense of a world that was completely inexplicable to them at the time. And I think it also has continuing utility for those purposes. I think there will always be some level at which we can't understand existence. And so not having to spend your whole life dealing with those existential questions leaves you to be more productive in what is becoming a more and more complex society. And that's part of the issue here, too. One of the things that I think this movement can be very useful for is giving people the opportunity to at least theoretically understand how the world works, how physics works, for instance, how the universe is structured, at least conceptually, so that they can operate with a basic philosophical understanding of things through allegory and stories, and much of what religion has become used for now, but also to do away with some of the additional burdens of the pre-existing religions of the world, and that so that somebody can then spend their brain power and the majority of their focus and development on the things they really want to do with their life. One of the things that I think makes a solid secular religion really important in the coming years and the coming generations is that society is becoming so much more vastly complex than it has been. You can't be a polymath today the same way you could have been for the previous hundreds of years of human existence. You really have to specialize. You have to get exceptionally good at something or a few things. We've gotten to a point now where it's not possible to learn everything about all that we know of. In fact, things have become so extraordinarily complex that there might not be a single subject anybody can know all of the information about. We have that much going on. One example that always comes to mind for me is the tax code. I believe I read somewhere that if you spent your entire life reading all of the tax code, you would actually never finish it. And yet we're subject to these laws. So in the same way that you have to conceptually understand things like tax code so that you can do your job and fulfill your social obligations and pay your taxes, I think there's some very real value in having a religious philosophy laid out that distills down most of what we should understand about the world, at least on a superficial level, like you understand tax code, so that you can have something that will make sense of how we interact with the world, how we explore the world, without having to know everything about how it works, except for the things that are particularly pertinent to you and your situation in your life, so that you can focus on really doing your best work. Simultaneously, I think it's important that there be something newly created that takes into account and appreciates our current understanding. But so now, one of the reasons that I wouldn't piggyback on any pre-existing religion is it is my impression, and I think it's fairly accurate to say, that they are burdened by a lot of superstitious rules and things that can be interpreted in ways that are very damaging to progress and human collusion and solidarity. One of the things that I want to accomplish throughout the course of thinking about this, debating about it, and creating what we will be creating here is to make something that really has a world vision for people as a whole. It shouldn't be culturally biased one way or another. And in fact, I would like to keep it so that it's not religiously biased. So somebody might be part of the Jedi Order and still practice their own religion. I don't want to necessarily compete with other religions. I don't necessarily want to replace them. But I think there's a real value in creating a secular system. And I'm hesitant to use the word religion, but in effect, it's filling in the hole that religions were originally imagined to fill. So I'm actually hoping over the course of going through this and having conversations with people that maybe we can come up with a better word. But for right now, please be patient with when I use the term religion. I don't necessarily mean to create superstitions and large God complex rules for people to live by. It's really just that it seems the brain needs certain things, and what religion has done over the course of history has fulfilled some of those needs, and I'm doing this to fulfill those needs in a new way. So now, why a Jedi Order? Why follow the mythos of a Star Wars imagined religion? And this relates to something I learned while studying Buddhism. And I've studied several religious philosophies over my 35 years of life. And one of the things I learned that I thought was very interesting about Buddhism is when Buddha, Shakyamuni, excuse me if I pronounce that wrong, but when he achieved enlightenment and thought about how to disseminate this information into the existing culture, he realized he had to accept the existing gods of his country and embrace them into the Buddhist philosophy, otherwise nobody would hear it. And so the reason that I landed on Jedi when thinking about the problem of religion, of having, any kind of world philosophy or secular philosophy or something like a religion, is that it would be very easy to be compared to something that doesn't fully explain what I was hoping to achieve by thinking about this in the first place. But simultaneously, the Jedi is something that is a concept, it's already in the public. I think it's safe to say most people see it very favorably. Star Wars might be the most successful movie franchise in history, so there's already some understanding of what the philosophy is likely to be, but there's also, for the vast majority of people, I think, that haven't been really engrossed in Star Wars mythos and backstory and legacy and extended universe and all that stuff, there's enough ambiguity there that they can understand the concepts and not get caught up in preconceived notions about exactly what the practice should be, about what the philosophy is going to be. It's known on a very superficial level and very basic stuff like, good versus evil, light versus dark sort of thing. So it has the simultaneous benefit of at least hinting at what the intention would be behind the religion and not giving so much information that people will assume things that might not necessarily be true. Further, because it's something familiar and already has a lot of love from people, I think that makes it a lot easier to say, I'm a Jedi, or, I follow Jediism, and not have people turn away from it, turn their nose up to it, have a immediate negative reaction because there's no negative association, and you're not building from ground zero. So you have something, they've already been introduced to the concept in some way. So it just makes it a lot easier to bridge the gap. So now, one of the things that I want to say too, and this is somewhat interesting, I think anyway. When I was thinking about this, I was thinking about religion in general, what purpose it has served. I was thinking about mankind in general, and I was thinking about culture in general, and I think we're at a cultural crossroads right now, and I think we're dealing with a lot of questions that we haven't dealt in a long time. And as a matter of fact, I believe we are in a philosophical evolution right now, or a revolution, depending on how you want to think about it. But I think there's a lot of questions that we have to ask now that we haven't had to ask in a very long time, and the decisions that we make in society and the conclusions that we come to are going to guide humanity's development for the next several hundred, if not the next 1,000 years. So I think it's important that we really do think about these things and make some really important decisions and make some really significant contributions to future generations, because what we set in place now, I think, is going to have a massive long-term impact, possibly beyond anything that I or anybody else might be able to imagine. We're in unprecedented times of change. So, but as I was saying, what I think is possibly very interesting about this whole project for me is, as I was thinking about these things and how they all interact, and what should we be doing, what should I be doing, what should be my work, this whole concept just came as a sort of inspired idea. I literally woke up one morning with it. I don't even remember at this point, because it was a year ago, if it was as a result of a dream or something I had thought about before I fell asleep and woke up, but it came to me almost whole cloth. I realized that this was a good idea, and just how thoroughly a good idea it was, and how much material there is there to work with very, very well. Some things I've put together, and some things will be put together over the course of many years, if not decades. One thing I want to say for certain is that I cannot be certain about anything that I think. This is not a one-man show. It's not going to be something that I set down and then it's done. It's certainly not going to be something that even over a short period of time is set down and then considered done. One of the things that's going to have to happen is many different people from many different backgrounds who have an interest in doing something like this will hopefully come together, form the first quasi-Jedi council, and we'll talk about how to think about the philosophy. How, for instance, what is the Force? What does it mean? How do we think about it? And practically too. I don't want to suggest that we're going to be actual Jedi. We're going to build lightsabers, and the Force is used to move rocks and things like that. This really is meant to be, on one hand, allegorical, but on the other, something that can act as a guiding light. Like I said, the gaps that religion has previously filled in, I want to be able to fill that in with this secular approach to religion. So I hope you get the impression from that, at least, also, that I want this to be a conversation. I'm going to share my ideas, and I'm going to put them in the best terms that I can, but also I'm a fallible human being. I might not always word it exactly the way that I hope it to be understood. So I hope that people will be somewhat patient with me, and this will be an ongoing conversation, and that eventually some people will volunteer themselves to speak with me. Instead of me just putting out my ideas, I really, really want to work and collaborate with other people who would like to see something like this come to fruition and really be impactful, to really leave something in the world that will ultimately be for its good. So, that being said, let me dive a little bit into some of the things that I've considered and thought about, and maybe we can get the conversation rolling. So I think the most fundamental question right off the bat is going to be, if we don't live in a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, what is a modern Earth-based Jedi Order going to look like? What is a Jedi? What is the Force? Things like that. What is a Sith? And I want to say right off the bat, I think there are useful stories between Jedi and Sith in the fantasy mythos of Star Wars, but I don't think that people are necessarily Jedi or Sith. That's useful in Star Wars because there's Force powers. We don't have Force powers, so I'm not sure if I'll even employ the language of somebody being a Sith. Uh, Partly because I think any level of disparaging philosophy in a religion will always lead to some form of tyranny. You know, to have God and the devil, you have something you're supposed to aspire to and something you're supposed to be afraid of and avoid. And I think there's inherent problems with that alone. And it can be manipulated and corrupted and turned into something that it really should not be. But that being said, the way I think about it, as of right now, as of today, what is it, February 24th, 2019, Jedi is a person following the Jedi path or the Force. And you're on that path or you are not. You know, there isn't necessarily becoming a Sith. So I've been trying to think about the term Jedi and what it will mean, and in particular as it pertains to a religion, because one of the things that you have to establish is a hierarchy within the religious order and how people can go through, for instance, a learning track to become what would be a priest or a Jedi master or whatever the term we might come up with will be. I want to be careful because when I think of a Jedi Knight, I don't think that would be appropriate to describe somebody who's, you know, just going up through the ranks, for instance, of the religion, somebody who teaches, someone who acts as a counselor, what have you. And I think, for instance, the Jedi Order or the Jedi Council, the council should be how the church operates. So rather than having one person get up and give a sermon, I think it should be an ongoing conversation, and maybe indefinitely. I'm not sure. I expect, though, that over time, perhaps there will be more than one Jedi book. Perhaps there'll be more than one type of Jedi Order. For the record, I picked the Jedi Order of North America just because I think JONA sounds good. You have to go with something that was the best I came up with at this point. So that may evolve over time as well. And what I would like to accomplish is to have a central council divided up into smaller councils, divided up into individual locations, something along those lines. So there'll be a sort of hierarchy. And what I think should happen is that any decisions, any doctrine, if you will, should be formulated by consensus. So, you know, perhaps there'd be representatives from each council that would then talk to the next higher up level council until you get to the Supreme Council, and they determine what should be whatever the core is of the entire Jedi Order. And then that gets disseminated down. But then individual orders will have their own ethos. They'll have their own doctrines. They'll have, you know, because they have their own constituencies. So certain things might not necessarily make sense, or certain things might have to be interpreted through cultural backgrounds or what have you. So I do believe that within the Jedi Order, within the Jedi religion, there will be some variance, but there also must, by necessity, be universal truths. And part of the goal of the initial council and eventually the Supreme Council will be to figure out what are those universal truths. What are the things that are true for human beings across the board, regardless of cultural backgrounds? And then smaller, though higher councils from just the individual locations should then be figuring out what does this mean from within our culture and how should it inform what we do in our societies and in our communities. In terms of organizing some of these things, one of the things that I think would be invaluable and that I hope to at least encourage, if not enforce, in anybody who wants to participate in debating or thinking through these things on a deeper level, you know, somebody who would be, for instance, part of the initial council to determine exactly what the Jedi religion should look like. I think every member should maintain something like their own individual Bible. So all of the conversations I would like to have recorded and put out like this, either in video or podcast format, so that people can always see and trace through the thought processes that we're following, and give feedback, and we can talk about it and continue on and grow and have as much perspective as possible throughout the entire course of this endeavor. But that in addition to that, that each member of the council, they're going to learn things as we have conversations, as we have debates, and I'd think it'd be really, really invaluable to have them write down their thoughts, to think it over, to reiterate the things that they heard, to read it, to review it, rewrite it. Each member would have their own sort of book, I suppose, but it'll be very involved, especially as people are on board longer and longer periods of time. And then maybe eventually these things will get distilled down into individual core pieces of doctrine. Now, one of the things we will, of course, have to discuss and make some determinations on and think about is, what is the Force? And so I've been thinking about this from a couple of different perspectives. And a lot of my thoughts stem from, of course, the very first introductions that we got from Obi-Wan and Yoda about, the Force binds all things, it is between all things. It seems to go up to or just before being God. And I want to be careful, though, too, to stay away from something metaphysical that can't be proven and that makes claims about the nature of existence that are delusional. That's one of the issues that I have with a lot of the existing religion is there, if you translate what's said literally, and in some cases it seems like there isn't any other translation because it's being dictated by what is supposed to be a supremely intelligent God, you get an impression of the world that isn't necessarily reality. And I really don't want to get into specifics about that. This is not to down any particular religion, but there are examples that cause people to be irrational. So, in thinking about how to talk about the Force and how to teach what the Force is and how to make it something that's practical and applicable to daily life, one of the things that I thought about is, well, there's a light side and a dark side of the Force. And it's not necessarily that it's in the world. All right, well, let me back up. So one of the first things that I thought of is that the Force is a blanket term that could mean anything that exists in nature that we don't necessarily currently understand. And I mean that on an individual level. So one of the things that I think is interesting and can be very unique about what I want to accomplish is that by using the term the Force and not making it the end-all be-all godlike law of existence, just saying that the Force is everything that is and ever will be, but not that you can't understand what that means. So, for instance, astrophysics would be a feature of the Force. It's not necessary for everybody that lives and breathes on the planet to understand astrophysics. If we can boil down astrophysics and how it generally works into something and explain it by saying this is the way of the Force, the person then has every freedom to go and explore astrophysics, and the two don't need to clash. So it's not to say that, if we explain something away in a simplified manner by saying this is the Force, it's not to dictate to them how they should think about these things or the only way to think about these things, but it's to give it a fair enough explanation that you can go ahead with the rest of your life. And when you think about what the Force is, it helps give you some understanding of your place in the world. So, and one of the other things that I thought about, for instance, the light versus dark side, one of the things that I think the Force would explain is how things relate to each other. So, how we relate to our environment, how all things in nature are very clearly interdependent, and there is a balance in that, and that's the will of the Force, so to speak. And the way that you act and behave and treat other people, and the things that you accept as treatment unto yourself, all of those things, all of the things that go into your head and out from your head, that is an interaction with the Force. And light or dark behaviors, things that a Jedi would do versus things that a Sith might do. For instance, selfless versus selfish behavior. You are not necessarily manipulating the world, but you are in fact interacting with the Force, and what it's doing is shifting the light or dark within you. So one of the ways that I thought to put this is whether you commit to the actions of the Jedi or not doesn't determine how you change the world, as some metaphysical practitioners might suggest, but it does change yourself, and that changes how you impact the world. And so with that base understanding, all of the things that are the core tenets of a Jedi should lead to you being a better person in the world and contributing things that would be of the light or better for mankind as a whole. And so now, real quick, I want to wrap this up and keep this relatively short. Eventually, I suspect that we'll move to possibly hour-long discussions or what have you, but I'm just starting off, and I'm really just trying to spitball some ideas and get some idea of what kind of interest level is out there. If you're interested, if you're curious, if you like what you have so far, or you have some questions. So far, what I have is I've set up a Facebook fan page, which I will link in the description of this video or the notes of the podcast. And I have a group set up on Facebook as well that I want to have conversations specifically with people who would like to be part of forming the core philosophies of this order. If you're interested in that, the links will be down below. Please feel free to leave me any feedback, any thoughts. I'm very much open to constructive criticism. And if you're at all interested, I hope you'll join me on this journey. And of course, may the Force be with you.